The CNBC app. Global market news in one place. Customizable sections and personalized alerts. Stocks tracking, interactive charts and market insights all in your hands. Stay connected. Stay informed. Download the CNBC app today.
A very warm welcome to Squawk Box. I'm Steve Sedgwick with Karen Cho, and these are your headlines. Divisions deepen amongst European allies over potentially sending peacekeeping troops to Ukraine as US and Russian officials prepare to meet in Saudi Arabia.
It is completely premature and completely the wrong time to have this discussion now. I'm even a little irritated by these debates, I have to say.
French Finance Minister Eric Lombard tells CNBC the way the EU is managed must change, and he calls for the bloc to make a common stand in the face of Donald Trump's presidency.
Europe now has to put its acts together to answer, and totally confident that Europe will be at the level of the challenge.
Chinese tech stocks drive higher in Hong Kong, continuing the bullish run and pushing the Hang Seng Tech Index to a 3-year high. And Germany's top candidates for Chancellor are grilled in a town hall just days before the country goes to the polls. Investor Ann-Kristin Achleitner tells CNBC the business sector has lost its way.
I feel we're lacking ambition. We have been good for such a good time that we somehow got used to it. Apart from being ambitious again, I think what we need is speed. We've become too slow for various reasons.
Meanwhile, the Reserve Bank of Australia cuts rates for the first time in over 4 years, while downgrading its economic outlook.
A warm welcome to the show. So, European leaders remain split on whether they would send troops to enforce a potential Ukraine peace agreement after a meeting in Paris convened by President Macron. France and the UK have expressed a willingness to deploy military resources in a peacekeeping effort. But leaders from countries including Germany, Poland and Italy have shown some scepticism. The UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer said the US would need to be involved in any guarantees offered to Ukraine.
We're at the very early stage of the process. Europe must play its role. And I'm prepared to consider committing British forces on the ground alongside others if there is a lasting peace agreement. But there must be a US backstop, because a US security guarantee is the only way to effectively deter Russia from attacking Ukraine again.
Speaking to reporters after the meeting, the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz expressed his frustration over questions about potential troop deployments.
It is completely premature and completely the wrong time to have this discussion now. I'm even a little irritated by these debates, I have to say. People are talking here about possible variants of outcomes over the heads of Ukraine, about the outcome of peace talks that have not taken place, and with which Ukraine has not said yes and has not sat at the table. This is highly inappropriate. To put it bluntly and honestly, we don't even know what the outcome will be.
Leaders also discussed ways to increase defence spending at the meeting, including a proposal backed by President Macron for common EU borrowing, and a suggestion from Commission President Ursula von der Leyen for a temporary easing of deficit rules to facilitate defence spending. Expectations for higher spending levels across the continent sent Europe's defence and aerospace sector to a record high on Monday's trade.
French President Emmanuel Macron said he spoke to US President Trump and Ukraine's President Zelensky after the meeting, calling for strong security guarantees for Ukraine and increased defence investment. And let's get out to Charlotte for more. Charlotte, it was a huge day in defence stocks yesterday. We saw the market pile into the trade that if there is any end to the war, that Europe may have to step up its investments. Just talk to us about the meeting and what sort of measures Macron is now pushing for.
Yes, well, a lot of the conversation that we have over the past few weeks when you talked about France were around the budget. And, finally, over the weekend, France now has a budget. And there's a lot of squeeze on public spending. And you have to square the circle for a lot of these European countries about trying to tighten their belt while at the same time, given the situation in Ukraine and with the return of Trump to the White House, on spending more in defense. And that's really the challenge that they're facing at the moment. So when I had a conversation yesterday with Eric Lombard, the French economy and finance minister in Brussels, he was about to meet his peers around this conversation, during this week, but there's a new sense of urgency around European defense, and this could be a crucial week when it comes to European security. And so we talked about what Europe is ready to do in order to increase defense spending, while also, of course, keeping an eye on their deficit. And so when I sat down with him, I put him this topic on the table, and this is what he said.
The world has changed drastically in the last 3 years, by the way. It has started with the invasion of Ukraine by the Russians, and also now with the different policy put forward by President Trump. The answer for Europe is very simple and straightforward. We have to seek strategic autonomy. And strategic autonomy means also autonomy in terms of defense and to have our own defense industrial base. For that, the Commission will make proposals, and of course we will take that into account. Let me remind to people who are listening to us, France is already doing a significant effort, more important than many European countries, in terms of defense. We have a strong army, we have heavy defense spendings. So I think the first step maybe would be to be more balanced between European countries. But also, again, we will see the proposals of the European Commission. It is important that we share the burden, but again, with a view of getting to a strategic autonomy where we are not yet.
And stability and growth, of course, necessary to geopolitical relevance. President Macron was talking about an electroshock coming after Trump coming back to the White House. After everything we heard during the Munich security meeting over the weekend, the comments from J.D. Vance, do you see your European peers ready for action now? Is the electroshock freezing people, or do you feel like there's a new sense of urgency amongst your peers?
Yes, the electroshock is now. We had the election of Donald Trump. We had the speech of J.D. Vance at the Munich summit. By the way, President Macron is gathering European leaders, including our British allies in Paris today. And Europe now has to put its acts together to answer, and totally confident that Europe will be at the level of the challenge, because it is a historical challenge. It is a historical turnaround, and we have to change the way European Union is managed, and that is the responsibility of politicians around the table, and we will be up to the challenge.
That was Eric Lombard, the French economy and finance minister, speaking to me yesterday. And, here again, President Macron leading the emergency meeting here about Ukraine here in Paris. And, what you can say about President Macron is that many times make the right diagnosis, at the right time, when there was the electroshock moment, is the most recent comments about Trump coming back to the White House, where it was the brain-dead NATO a few years back. He puts diagnosis in a shock way, but he kind of gives that shock moment for maybe other European leaders to kind of jump into action. The question is bringing some partners on board with his view and actually take action after putting down the diagnosis. And that's why he was trying to do, I guess, yesterday, bringing all those European partners around the table. But they have to unlock, there's a lot of discussion in Europe. We know there's this defense white paper that the Commission has to present in March. There's tweaking those fiscal rules to allow defense spending to not be part of the deficit rules. But again, it takes time. And that's the question. Does Europe have time, especially when it comes to the question of defense and of Ukraine? That is a question. But certainly there is a will for action, but whether there will actually be action, the question is still open.
Charlotte, I actually had a degree of sympathy from the Scholz side of things, that it was the wrong conversation at the wrong time, talking about peacekeepers. I think there are many bigger issues here, not least the fact that actually the US security guarantees, which have been a concern over recent years, and of course under Trump 45, for Europe and indeed in mutual protection, one has to question the ability of those now. So actually, I think the real question goes back to perhaps something that Macron raised years ago, that what is the future of NATO? And actually, does Europe, which I've always thought, no, actually Europe's best defence is within NATO. Now that those US security guarantees are less sure, actually, do we need to start, well, given those Vance comments, by the way, in Munich is my point, do we now need to think about a body of which Europe creates a mutual defence assurance pact outside of NATO? I wonder how much of that came up over the last 48 hours.
No, and there really is a conversation here. Again, those comments from Chancellor Scholz saying, look, this is not time to have this conversation because, by the way, we're getting to 3 years of that war and Ukraine is not losing that war. You know, the situation is difficult in the east, but, you know, for a war that was supposed to last a few weeks, 3 years on, you know, Ukraine is still fighting. So talking about a peace deal and having those troops on the ground kind of gives the game away, so that you understand the position potentially there from Chancellor Scholz, but you understand the position from the UK or potentially France to kind of bring some security guarantees from Europe themselves, given the comments that we're getting from the US administration, the talks happening today in Saudi Arabia, where Europe is just not around the table, it's between the US and Russia. So, you know, they want to be heard, they want to say, you know, they have geopolitical relevance. But here again, geopolitical relevance comes by defense spending, and that's one of the things. They've raised their defense spending, these European countries, but a lot of them are not spending enough just yet, and Poland is almost at that 5% of GDP that the Trump administration is pushing for, but a lot of the other European countries are just around 2%, and a lot of them are way below that. Spain is at 1.2%. So, you know, there is still that conversation there about defense spending, unlocking billions of euros for defense spending, defense mergers as well, you know, make the defense industry more productive as well. So that is that whole conversation that needs to be happening at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. All absolutely enormous, weighty issues. Thank you very much indeed for that. So, as we've been saying as a backdrop, senior US and Russian officials, no EU officials, no representative from the continent of Europe where this war is taking place, okay? Senior US and Russian officials only are meeting in Riyadh today for discussions over the potential Ukraine peace deal. No Ukrainians, by the way. Ukrainian officials were not invited to be part of today's talks. But President Zelensky says he will meet with Saudi officials in Riyadh later this week. Dan, this is extraordinary. It's a fast-moving feast. We don't know what's potentially going to happen between Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump, and there's a lot of talk about that as well. Extraordinary times. Just talk us through it.
Yeah, you've got it, Steve. So Middle East diplomacy in full swing here. We're seeing the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, and the Special Envoy Steve Witkoff all in Riyadh today. They're going to be meeting with Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and, of course, the top Kremlin aide Yuri Ushakov as well. The goal here is to have a meeting about a meeting. The ultimate aim, essentially, is to pave the way for what could be historic peace talks between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin in Saudi Arabia. And, of course, as Charlotte was just mentioning, these are talks that could ultimately reshape the future of Ukraine and European security. The first point I wanted to make is just on Saudi Arabia itself. The venue and the choice of meeting location is no accident here. What we've seen in the last couple of years is Riyadh really positioning itself as a global mediator. We've seen Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman really leveraging the growing influence that he has with both Moscow and Washington. So it shouldn't necessarily be a surprise that this was the place where this conversation is going to take place. It certainly reflects how the Crown Prince is well and truly out of the cold here. But of course, at the center of these discussions is a ceasefire plan, and not everyone is convinced. The Trump administration has already made some pretty major concessions to Russia here. They've ruled out Ukraine's NATO membership. They've rejected putting US troops on the ground as well. And also in the last couple of weeks, we've heard the Trump administration acknowledging Russia's recent territorial gains in Ukraine as well, gains that it has been making since 2014. So exactly how this moves forward remains to be seen. And to your point, Steve, most critically, Ukraine and the European allies aren't even at the table in this meeting about a meeting. And of course, that has really sent shockwaves through what is a very fragile Europe at the moment. So there's that. But then also, happening on the sidelines here is Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, who is also in the UAE. He's been signing a major trade deal with the Emiratis. Only, look, a couple of hours away from Saudi Arabia. He's in the right place at the right time, or you could say perhaps the wrong place at the right time, but he's certainly not backing down here. He has also said that, of course, Ukraine will not be accepting any deal that is made behind Ukraine's back. But I also think it's fair to say here, you know, what leverage he actually has and how much political capital he actually has under the Trump administration is unclear at this point. If they wanted him in the room, he would be there. Of course, the pressure is also on to try and strike a deal here, one that ultimately stops the war without handing total victory to Moscow. That's the clear concern in Europe. A deal that does not weaken Ukraine. What the security guarantees look like are, of course, a big question mark at this point. And the ultimate goal, of course, is to not shatter NATO unity in the process. If Putin's goal was to drive a wedge between the Western nations, between the US and Europe, I would put to you it seems to be working at this point. Back over to you.
And I will draw attention, Dan, to just drawing on what you've just said there, to the China hawks within the Republican Party stateside as well. They will point out, and US senators, very senior US senators point out to me, and I'm sure you've heard the same conversations, that what Trump does in Ukraine has enormous ramifications for the China relationship, Trans-Pacific as well. And if the Chinese seem to think that actually the US is a soft touch on Russia in Ukraine, what does that mean for Taiwan going forward as well? And that's what some of the Republican hawks that I've spoken to are very concerned about. Dan, excellent coverage as ever. Thank you very much. Analysts at Citi have tipped a number of defence stocks they expect to benefit from a ramp up in European defence spending. It's a terrific piece. You can check out the full list on our subscription service, CNBC Pro.
Coming up on the show, Elon Musk unveils Grok 3 as competition intensifies in the AI chatbot space. Plus, Chinese tech stocks hit a 3-year high despite a rocky few days for Baidu. And French IT firm Capgemini reporting fourth quarter earnings. We'll talk through the results with the group CEO, Ayman Azet. That is coming up at 8:15 GMT. Let's take a look at the Asian market. Again, we're still seeing the DeepSeek effect for the Chinese markets. Technology stocks in particular still in focus, climbing to a 3-year high on some of those big tech names. The Hong Kong market itself perched high. You can see almost 1% in the green. Shanghai trades a fraction weaker, and you were bookended by a modest upside for Japanese and South Korean stocks. Don't forget the US has been out of action, so no direction from the US markets overnight. To what we're getting on the Japanese yield curve, as we take a look at that Japanese market and Japanese assets, it is fascinating. The market is now pivoting towards the potential for rate hikes again from the central bank. This on the back of GDP that surprised in the last quarter. It was growing at a clip of 2.8%. And don't forget the market thought 1% would be the expected growth rate. So that very strong GDP figure just setting the chain in motion, where you've now got assets back in the sights of investors on the growth potential and what it means in terms of rates. The assets that you're seeing here, in particular the 10-year, 1.43 on that yield. There's been a lot of movement there. The highest level really since about late 2009 on that 10-year is where we've climbed to. On the 20-year, we've seen a movement back around 2011 levels. So the market very much positioning around some of those yields. And let's take a look at the dollar crosses, and as a result, what we're seeing against dollar yen. First up, dollar trying to claw back a bit of territory at 152 the level, so up about 1/3% morning session. But on the other major pairs and crosses, euro sterling also showing some slippage. Dollar is king this morning, it seems, and to the Swissy as well, Steve.
Right, Samsung is set to cancel just over 3 trillion won worth of its own shares that it had previously acquired. It comes after the tech giant's November announcement that it would buy back 10 trillion won worth of shares. the company's first buyback since 2017. Investors elsewhere are eyeing fourth quarter Baidu results today. The company expected to post a 44% rise in net profit, whilst revenue is expected to fall, according to a poll by FactSet. This as the company grapples with a sluggish Chinese economy where growing its AI business is absolutely paramount. It comes after the Chinese search engine wiped $2.4 billion worth of market cap off its shares on Monday after the company's founder, Robin Li, was not seen in attendance at Xi Jinping's business leader symposium in Beijing.
The Hang Seng Tech Index hit a three-year high this morning. It comes after weeks of bullish sentiment around Chinese tech stocks following DeepSeek's AI breakthrough. Let's get to Tarek Dennison, who is wealth manager at GFM Asset Management. Tarek, we've heard a lot of signalling out of the Chinese this week, and President Xi holding a rare meeting yesterday with tech leaders, also trying to pull back on some of the bureaucracy that has meant the playing field hasn't been that friendly to tech investors. What do you make of what we've heard from the administration combined with the DeepSeek news? What does it suggest the upside potential is here?
Well, my first thought is the year 2021 playing in reverse? You know, have I actually turned on the TV and just seen that whole tech crackdown, that big theme that had really brought the Hang Seng Tech Index down from 10,000, well to the depths we've seen recently, up until it broke back above 5,000. Is that finally over? And we finally seeing a turnaround where Chinese officials and Chinese tech companies have made peace and are going to be able to go forward back on the business trajectory that they had before 2021. I think those of us with positions in China tech view that as the bull case. Many of us who've learned our lesson will still say, maybe don't be too optimistic, too excited just yet. A lot of this could just be fueled by hot money, people jumping the gun. But overall, the bull case remains that China has a monopoly. Chinese tech companies have a monopoly on their own internet systems, in a way that you cannot use Google or Facebook inside China and really along the Belt and Road. The question is whether that story is going to continue now that the officials have made peace.
There are twin themes here around what the government is trying to do to look like it's setting a green light for the industry versus the DeepSeek news. And if I just peel through some of the information that's crossed from the government today and that's removing bureaucracy, ensuring there's a right financing structure for some of the affordable financing measures here, but also counteracting that US threat when the Americans are trying to slow down Chinese tech. Is there anything the Chinese can do right now that would make it more helpful for Chinese tech to accelerate from here?
Well, if there is anything they could be doing, they've probably already been doing it behind the scenes. I think the DeepSeek news was a shock to many of us. The narrative that had been going on last year was that U.S. chips were not going to be sold to China. These, 3 nanometer and these ultra small chips, these cutting edge chips, weren't going to be available to the Alibabas and the Tencents. So they were going to be a decade or so behind the US on any AI development. DeepSeek pretty much showed that didn't necessarily have to be the case. Now, I think what I've seen in a lot of things, the number of AI models we've already seen in the West, ChatGPT is not the only thing. We've seen Gemini. We've heard earlier on this show that Grok 3 is coming out. The fact that they were able to develop DeepSeek, not only develop it, but develop it with much older and slower chips and do it on a much cheaper basis. I think that shows that China tech companies are going to be able to do what they need to do to stay ahead.
Yeah, Tariq, good morning to you, sir. I've got a couple of questions for you. One, US tech bans, global tech bans, are they stupid? And the reason why I ask that, because whilst you had the Chinese within your broader ecosystem relying on your IP technology in tech, relying on your chips, relying on the trickle of those cross-Pacific and from elsewhere as well. There was less incentive to develop your own. Now they need a greater degree of autarky. Have actually US tech bans actually gone right back in their face and actually created better China because of those bans?
Well, to anyone who asked that question, I ask, what would you have done instead? If you didn't have the tech ban, they simply would have had the more advanced chips on which to develop the technology. Then the question is, if they wanted to sanction them at that point, if they wanted to do a rug pull at that point, what would have happened? By doing the sanctions a little bit earlier, by doing those export bans a little bit earlier, they basically forced them to be able to adapt. I mean, when you don't have access to the cutting edge technology, you're forced to get crafty, you're forced to get creative, you're forced to economize. And generally, the teams of engineers who have to do that end up being more resilient, and they find out, hey, we didn't need $100 billion to do this. We could have done it on 6. And now that we've got the other 94 to play with, what can we do with that, given that we're already 20 times more efficient than what the Western companies have been doing? That's at least what many of us are thinking they must be doing over there right now.
Yeah. Okay, that's a great answer. Let me ask another question. Who is China trying to sell its amazing new products to as well, or these growing new products to? Because if it's to the Chinese consumer and Chinese industry, then it's tough at the moment because, of course, we know the Chinese economy is struggling to rebuild. Or is it to global customers? And if it's to global customers, how's that going to work compared with US peers?
Well, the old story, which I'm very, very keen to dust off and look back at it again, is the whole Belt and Road story. The whole idea of not just China's own domestic market, which is still significant and large, but pretty much all of the other countries in what is often called the global south, that China feels it will have an edge in serving versus the U.S. And a lot of the question that the people are having right now with the U.S. potentially forcing Europe to pay more for its own defense, cutting Europe out and making it less of an ally, is will there be any European countries who may start seeing China as a more reliable trade partner than the U.S.? The same thing with Africa, same thing with Latin America, the same thing with much of Central Asia. For 2021, the reason that we were able to see the China tech fall as much as it did was there was a lot of loss of optimism there too. There was a lot of the idea that the U.S. was able to isolate China and really force any market that mattered to say you pick the U.S. and you don't pick China. And I think they're going to try and pick up that battle again and see where they can regain market share.
Tarek, let me ask you about a couple of stocks. Tencent in recent days trying to upend the Baidu moat on search, which using DeepSeek. Alibaba has lent into the DeepSeek technology very quickly. Those two seem to be benefiting. Baidu seems to be somewhat challenged on this news flow. Just talk us through some of the potential gains that could be forthcoming for these three stocks.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned those three. The big two really that I follow are Tencent and Alibaba. One thing that I often have to explain to anyone outside of China who doesn't follow China so closely is Baidu is really quite in a different league than, say, Google would be in the West. In the West, Google is a multi-trillion-dollar company in the league with the other Magnificent Seven. But Baidu is an order of magnitude smaller than Alibaba or Tencent, simply because if you go to China, you don't Baidu search the same way that you would, say, Google search something out here. You use one of those apps. You generally will use, WeChat, or you'll directly go to, Tmall or Taobao to find things in a way that you won't do there. Even in the case of maps, another Alibaba app named Gaode is really challenging Baidu Maps. So I really have a question about Baidu's position. I think, like Yahoo, they're going to continue to have a following. But I think one reason that Baidu has been struggling is just quite simply competition from the giants. If you're Alibaba or you're Tencent, you have a much greater ability to say, hey, wait a minute, they just trained DeepSeek on 6 million. We've got 6 million 20 times over. We can develop lots and lots of those if you're Alibaba. You don't have quite as many of those if you're Baidu. So naturally their size is going to be an advantage to Alibaba and Tencent.
Thank you for listening to Squawk Box Europe Express.
For more market-moving news, you can head to CNBC.com.
Or join us again on the show with Steve Sedgwick, Karen Cho, and myself, Arabile Kumete, weekdays on CNBC.